Dennis Kane. I'm from the Department of Education, and we've been working in both the House and both the House and the Senate to work on a variety of issues around special education, early education. And when we saw that Reid was coming up to do a conference tomorrow in South Burlington, we wanted to take the opportunity to see if we could get Reid to fly up a day early and just spend a couple of hours with folks that might be interested here in talking about some of his research and his findings and from his sites and what's kind of going on with the National Institutes of Health and their interest in reading. And I was trying to think back to when I first met Reid, probably in the early 80s when I was working in Barrytown, and he came and I remember him doing a presentation. He left and I said, "That's one of the most impressive things I ever saw or heard." And I think every time I've seen Reid since then, I've walked away with the same feeling that it's one of the most impressive things I've seen or heard. So with that mild introduction, I'd like to present Dr. Reid Lyon from the National Institutes of Health. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I flew in here hoping for spring. Didn't work. I lived here for 12 years, so you all know I'm not a newcomer up this neck of the woods. I lived in Underhill, and I taught at the university and at St. Mike's and at Johnson State. I couldn't keep a job. But I'm delighted that Dennis has asked me to come up and explain to you what your federal tax money is buying you in terms of research on kids. And this will be informal. I'll take you through all of the things we're doing and the findings that seem to be converging heavily now. Just as a point of reference, a week from today, we will present to Congress, to the entire Congress, the report of the National Reading Panel. And just by way of background, this panel was charged, or we were charged at NIH to pull together individuals to review exhaustively all of the research in the area of beginning reading. And the reason for that was Congress at that level was getting ticked off because people were still arguing about how best to teach kids and what works and what doesn't work. So this report will clearly lay out what the actual clinical trials show, just as in pharmaceuticals and so forth, where we run different drug compounds to better understand treatment response. So have we done that with reading? And the results are very clear, and I'll take you through those today if that'll be of some interest to you. But that'll be available. It's I think the report will be a major contribution to the policy arena, at least, because it should help us guide decision-making at state and local levels in terms of how early we should see kids and what we should do with the youngsters and how best we can help them and so forth. You had mentioned that it was kind of interesting that the NIH studies reading, and it indeed is a little interesting, although it's not new. The NIH has actually been studying reading development and so on since 1965. The NIH, by the way, is the National Institutes of Health. And there are 26 institutes within that structure, most of which study organs and diseases, National Cancer Institute, National Eye Institute, and so forth. With the NICHD, the institute that's responsible for kids, their welfare and their public health and stuff like that. And a large part of the work we do is actually in how kids grow up, how they develop, and what they need to develop most productively. So we do have the largest reading research program in the world because we figure that if kids don't learn to read, they don't make it in life. And the downstream consequences of youngsters not learning to read are pretty horrendous. And it's not hyperbole. We follow children from the age of 4, 4.5, all the way into their 20s. So for those kids who don't have an easy time in school, it's quite easy to walk along with them. And it's quite sad to see what happens when they don't learn effectively. And reading is the toughest thing most kids have to deal with, at least in young school. And that's why we put a great deal of energy into it. We do the studies quite a bit differently than most people do them. We invest heavily in staying with the children as they grow up. We have found it's literally impossible to figure out children as they move along in their life without walking alongside, because they're moving targets developmentally. and they change so dramatically that if we try to study something that works, for example, in teaching them to read in the 4th grade, and in fact it works, we don't know if it's because it works or because it combines with something earlier. Or likewise, if it doesn't work, doesn't it work because of something earlier in the kid's life? So all the studies I'll be talking with you all about today are studies that begin with these children at 5 and 5.5 years of age. And what we do is we go into many sites around the country and we begin to study kids with from the general population. So we don't know if these kids are going to turn out to be good readers or not good readers or what have you. We take youngsters so that they mirror the population from which they live. So if we were in Vermont, the samples of kids would look exactly like our kids across Vermont, same as in Connecticut and so forth. So we look at just as many good readers over time as we do not so good readers, in fact, more, because we've got to try to figure out if somebody's doing well with learning how to read, how do they do it? So I'm going to put on some slides, and this by no way should constrain the discussion. Please feel free to ask anything you want as we go along. This is a program that's been in place for quite a long time, and it deals with 3 very straightforward questions, and that is, how do kids learn to read? And what I mean by that is, what are the skills and the abilities and the environments and the types of instruction kids need to be able to read so that they can understand it and use it to learn and actually enjoy it? There's a lot of kids in our particular country that aren't doing too well here. And that ranges from 33% of kids having difficulties in Connecticut to upwards to 58% of children not reading at a level where they can learn in California and Mississippi. So the lowest rate of lousy reading is Connecticut at 33%. That's pretty bad for a country with the resources we have. So we consider this a national emergency in a sense. When you have 33% of your population not doing well, and those are the same people who don't do well in life, occupationally or vocationally and everything else, it's time for us to start to figure it out. So the second question is, what causes it? I mean, what gets in the way of a lot of these kids who aren't learning to read? Is it in the water? Is it in the genome? Is it teaching? Is it motivation? What is it? What keeps youngsters from doing well as they try to pull print off a page? And the third question, and the one that may be of most interest to you all today, is what do you do about that? How can you prevent kids having difficulties learning to read, which is the most important early educational subject they have to deal with? And can we identify it early? Can we see kids in preschool or kindergarten that are at risk for reading failure? And if so, how much does it cost to identify those kids? And is it a laborious, bureaucratic thing, or can you do it fairly swiftly, clinically? And then what kinds of things can we do, not only in special education, but in regular education, to prevent these horrendous numbers coming up? That is, what teaching strategies or approaches are most powerful, most beneficial for kids at different stages of their development? And I don't know if you all see it. Yeah, you do, because when I lived here in Vermont, you had that same nonsense about phonics or whole language and stuff like that. I don't know if you're still faced with that. But the data are very strong in indicating who that works for, either one and so forth, and I'll take you through that today. But education sometimes puts things into policy and practice before the data have accrued yet. If you go out to California, they're arguing a great deal about bilingual education, whether you should teach kids in their native language and then transition them, or teach them fully in English. And there's not one whit of evidence either way. So we make all kind of cockamamie decisions on the basis of limited and fragmentary information. And what's unfortunate is I have to testify in front of Congress a lot. And I think, well, recently I was testifying in front of Senator Jeffords' committee, and Senator Kennedy asked, if we know all the world, are we still seeing all these kids having difficulties? That is, if the sends a shot, that's about what it takes. It's very cheap to be able to assess which kids have this or not. So what does it take to learn to read? It takes some background, but then it takes an understanding that the language that comes by the ear is actually composed of smaller sounds. And then it takes the ability to link those sounds to the print in front of the kid on the page. And phonics and this phonemic awareness stuff is non-negotiable. It has to be there. If it's not there, people don't learn to read. It's not something the kids have a choice at or of. So when you hear about, well, they don't need phonics or phonics is old and so forth and so on, unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, these are skills just like in any skill that are required. You can't play a piano without a number of foundational skills. You can't play athletic sports without certain foundational skills. And you certainly can't read unless you can understand that your language is made up of bitty sounds and you can lay those on top of letters. And what makes it difficult is the ear never hears the sounds. So you have to teach that. And some kids who come to school knowing that quite well and seem to read naturally are children who have been read to a great deal. And their moms and their grandmas and whoever has read to them and pointed out sounds and taught them from birth until school, a lot of this stuff. When we look at those kids who are natural readers and we study hard what they've done in their lives, we find their parents were very good teachers or their grandparents were very good teachers. They made them aware of the sounds and how they go along with the print. Very straightforward stuff that's been obfuscated over the years in favor of more romantic visions of reading. Just shower the children with good literature, for example, and they'll pick all of this up. Well, only a very small percentage of kids pick it up because it is a skill. It's not a natural act. Reading is very young in the evolutionary cycle of human stuff. You know, our speaking and listening is pretty old, but reading is very young. And we read differently or with different symbols than a lot of other languages. It's purely arbitrary. It's a skill that has to be learned. And the biggest impediment to most of our kids learning how to read well is how they're taught. It's not a learning disability as much as an instructional disability. And it's an instructional disability because teachers are doing the best they can, but they've never been presented with the appropriate kinds of information about what it takes to learn to read. It takes background. It takes interactions with language. It takes phonemic awareness. It takes phonics, applying the sounds to the letters. It takes doing that very quickly so that you're not bogged down and putting all of that together and you read fluently and it becomes unconscious. And it takes a lot of comprehension stuff. Takes a lot of work to understand what one is reading. So to make that story short, we have a pretty good idea of what has to be in place for children to learn how to read. So that's why it's such a disappointment when so many kids don't learn how to read, because we know what the conditions are. Background, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, and comprehension. We also know that teaching that kind of array of skills will result in lousy reading if it's not done directly enough or systematically enough, and so on. And that's what this National Reading Panel report will show next Thursday, that all of these things are required to learn how to read, but if you expect kids to pick these skills up by virtue of happenstance or by providing them with wonderful amounts of reading material, they're not going to do that. They simply won't do it. Now, if we can identify what it takes to learn to read, what goes wrong is most of these kids, whether they're from poverty or whether they are learning disabled children, and let me distinguish those two. Kids from poverty come into school, typically, not knowing what they're supposed to do. Typically, these children have come into kindergarten and first grade, and they've been provided fairly broad experiences. They haven't been taught about these sounds and how sounds go with letters, even in a fun way. So they continue on their academic careers, expected to read more and more complex stuff, and they still don't know what the tools are to unlock the code. They've never been taught that. This expectation that they'll be picking it up on their own puts them further and further behind. If we wait until they're 9 years of age, for whatever reason, the majority of those children will continue to have reading difficulties for the rest of their life. And that goes with any kid. If we don't get to kids by 9 years of age, the majority of them have the same difficulties in the 6th grade and the 12th grade, 10 years after graduating and so forth. And what we do know, because we study it hard, is we can go after a 16-year-old and teach them to read, but it takes about 4 times as long as it does when they're young. And most kids at 16 don't want to deal with it anymore. They'll tell you where to stick your teaching materials. All right, so there's a couple of issues here. Most kids at risk for reading failure and many children identified as learning disabled really aren't. They are instructionally disabled. They have come into school without background and they've been provided very general kinds of instruction which hasn't taught them the skill. They have been expected to pick that skill up on their own, and they have not done that. A very small percentage of our population, probably no more than 7% of our kids have a learning disability. Not 12%, not 20%, but anywhere from 2 to 5 to 7%. And these are kids who would be expected to learn how to read extremely well. They have had a good deal of background. They've been read to since they were young. They've had the privilege of a lot of books in the home. They've had good resources provided to them, and they still hit the wall. They're still very slow, labored readers. In those children, we do see evidence, genetic evidence and neurophysiologic evidence that seems to indicate that they have some differences there, and that is difficult for them. And some of those children, anywhere from 2 to 5% of the children in our very intensive trials aren't responding at all. But that's much different from 33 to 50% of children not responding. The majority of children, if we get to them early enough and powerfully enough, come right along, right up to the average range. Now, one of the things that's gotten people into a bind, not only in Vermont, but in many states, has been the practice of watching kids come into school, even teachers telling you some of those kids may have difficulties in the future, and then waiting for them to catch up. Because one thinks that, well, they're immature, or it's a developmental lag, or whatever. It's neither of those, and children don't catch up. And when the special education policies begin to interact with this, it typically is in the form of learning disabilities. And those of you who work in this area know that to identify a learning disability in most states, the kid has to show us a gap between their IQ, which is a proxy for their potential, and their achievement. So they have a discrepancy. But that discrepancy between measured IQ and reading or math or writing won't open up enough until the child's about 9 to 10 years of age. And we already know that 9 to 10 years of age is the end point for any kind of intervention to really be successful. So in a sense, the special ed policy has put into place a wait to fail model. So, why is that? Well, that's probably because long ago, the federal government wanted to put a cap on the number of kids who could be identified as LD because it's a vague and ambiguous definition. And if kids weren't learning in schools, it was found that a lot of kids would be sent under this diagnosis for specialized help. But to keep that number low, they put these criteria in that meant that you had to show a gap between IQ and achievement. Well, it's an invalid gap, too. Because let's say you guys on this side of the room have high IQs and low reading, and us on this side of the room have not so high IQs just for today and poor reading. You guys are called LD, we're called Title I. You guys are called LD or dyslexic, we're called garden variety poor readers. You guys are called LD, we're called slow learners. We don't have the gap. But what we know is there's really no difference between you and us at that level of reading. That is, the same interventions have the same effect. The causes of the difficulty in reading are the same, and so on. So not only is that IQ achievement gap dangerous because it withholds treatment, it also is an invalid marker for the particular difficulty we're going after. That is, it doesn't differentiate kids with without a discrepancy and kids who have a discrepancy at that level of reading. Just doesn't do it. It doesn't do it in treatment, doesn't do it in diagnosis, doesn't do it in developmental course. A lot of us thought it would, but that's science. So that's been overturned. Just doesn't seem to tell us much. So what have we done? We've painted ourselves into a corner, and we've strayed from a great deal of converging evidence. And this has been around for 5-6 years. And what I'm saying is that it is clear that states like Texas in particular, and California now under some kind of force, and some other states have begun to step back and screen every child at 5 years of age for these kinds of difficulties that I'm talking about. And in Texas, that's a job, given the nature of their population. That's extremely heterogeneous, and so on. Now, Texas is moving quite strongly in the sense that they've now built their programs where all children are screened. It takes about 30 minutes. They can identify with about 85 to 90% accuracy those kids at risk. There is no identification of any special needs in kindergarten or first grade or second grade. They are provided whatever they need and so forth. And hopefully that'll show some promise. The data may show that, in fact, achievement rates come up. But the difficulty is you can put all of these things into motion, but who's going to do it? Who's going to identify the kids? Who has the skills to do that? Who's going to teach the kids in kindergarten and first and second grade? Who's going to do that? So Texas has had to figure out how they can begin to impart to regular classroom teachers and kindergarten teachers, as well as special educators, the same things we're talking about here today. What does it take to learn to read? You know, you can't do anything about the background and experience, but you can do something about teaching kids the sounds of their language. You can teach kids how to link those sounds to the letters and letter patterns. You can teach kids to do that quickly. You can teach kids how to understand what they read, but you have to teach them. The kids don't teach themselves. Sometimes I'm a little alarmed at the amount of money we spend on some of this stuff, and it does come down to very good informed teaching. And we're not getting a lot of that in any of our states. And in Texas, which probably has the lead in understanding these things and how to move it at a big policy level, they're still struggling with what you do, because it's hard to change colleges of education. They are the bastions of academic freedom and tenure and stuff like that. And there's really no accountability at that level. You know, in medicine, there's accountability because there's some legal ramifications for malpractice, and education that hasn't come along down the pipe very well, but it may in the future. So who knows? But it's very difficult to move the kinds of information, the converging evidence, the scientific evidence into practice, primarily because of the resistance at the academic levels. It's clearly not among the teachers who want and ask for and cry out for, what do I do? How can I help these kids? Teachers want to do the best for these kids. It's more at the policy level and at the academic levels that we run into the problem. Now, let me just show you. Some kids wanted to, this is probably beating a dead horse, but some children wanted me to share with you guys what it was like not to be able to read. These are kids in Syracuse, New York. They started with us when they were 5, and they have a fairly hefty job. Before we start to work on their reading problems, we fly them down to Yale University and we image their brains so we can see if brains are different in kids who don't read. And so they go through that, but they have a lot of fun with that, much more than adults do for some reason. Plus, it's the first time they've ever flown anywhere. So then we have to worry about, do we have to fly the control groups around? And so, but anyway, then they come back and they go through the different instructional kinds of things and so forth. And they have to do that for about 5 years. Now, they don't think that teachers or parents or legislators know much about the stuff they go through. So they asked us if they could tell us what they go through. And we said yes, so we had to invest in this. So you're going to see a bunch of kids from Syracuse talk to you for about 10 minutes, 11 minutes, and they want to tell you what it's like to go through this. And let me just put this on. Dennis, I'm not sure which. Is this on, you think?
Seems so.
Yeah.
Picture this. A storm sweeps over the earth, sucking up words, letters, and syllables. All of these tumbling in confusion, clouds, and alphabets. The drone of earthlings, desperate to make sense of the word fragments, drowns out all noise. Without print or speech, the world starts to shut down. People misunderstand one another. Violence breaks out everywhere, wiping out all but a few. For the survivors who can't read, it's the world before fire. Dark, lonely, and violent. An exaggeration? Maybe. But this turmoil goes on inside the millions who can't read. Forget statistics. Illiteracy is about people, survival, and public health. A few of us got together to make short films about our reading problems. This is my little film about things I've learned and experienced, sort of through not being able to read very well. And I'd draw a few pictures to maybe help you illustrate it and help you understand a little better. Hi. My name is Andrew.
I wanted to make this movie to help other kids that couldn't read. Can be.
When did you first suspect that Taya had a reading problem?
Well, I would have to say coming from school.
I guess the first picture is a school. Teachers, I don't think, sometimes mean to make fun of people who can't read well. And it really gets tough. Really, I remember a lot of the times I just try to always take the back desk, keep my head down, keep my hand down, and keep my mouth shut.
The teacher's saying, well, there might be a problem here. She's not developing with the class.
Because school's tough and everyone's trying to look for a way to fit in. And anyone who doesn't at all really gets ripped to pieces.
I used to read in front of class, and I tried to read this really, really hard book, and I'm like saying weird kind of words, and they're following it with me.
I like to play with my. What does it say? I can't read it.
Third grade, and you can't read. They all started laughing and pointing, and after that day, I had spots all over me because I was depressed. I used to say, I'm dumb, I'm not smart. I'd hate myself too. My brain would be like twisted and I'd be spinning. I couldn't find the button to stop it.
Some people don't want to be laughed at. And they just sort of decide that maybe the human race isn't such a great thing after all.
I had trouble reading. It was scary. I couldn't read anything.
And they don't want to be sort of talked to or associated with.
It made me want to run away from home. Chris, Mom said you can read this if you try. Come on, I want to say I still read this. What to say you, Chris? I don't like this book. Why is it too hard for you? No. I try to read, but I'd get frustrated. I would just keep on throwing the books around and through tantrums.
Sometimes I'd help him hard because I understood how he felt, reading the frustration and him crying. So he'd hide and my dad would look for him and we'd end up finding him. He just didn't really want to read. Sometimes it's funny because he could get out of reading by hiding.
I think every person who can't read or read well has done an isolation phase. Because again, it's just easier not to deal with it and just to disappear. So much rage, so much hate that you just need to lash out and strike something.
The problems with Joe not learning how to read didn't end at school. When he came home, there were times all throughout the afternoon and the evening that were frustrating for him and for the rest of us.
You're asking through the single player. So your single player is to select that.
Okay, now what?
What does it say?
Just tell me, what does it say?
He was expected to read certain things, and he couldn't do it. And he expected to be able to read certain things, and he couldn't do it. So there was constant tension in the family.
It made me get angry. You know, do my little tantrum, kind of became violent, I guess. It was just hard. That was the stressful part. That was the frustrating part.
Having problems with reading is bigger than just not being able to read.
What? I gotta do it again? I just can't read.
It has a much bigger effect on the child, on their self-esteem, the way they feel about themselves.
I became the tough guy, the goon, the brute, punk rocker, the scary guy that walks down the halls. You look tough, you dress tough, because you want to be left alone, but you still want to sort of be seen. You don't want to disappear. But you definitely, over all things, don't want anyone to laugh at you. Once someone laughs at you, you gotta beat them up. And you gotta beat them up pretty darn bad, so no one else will laugh at you.
What have we seen so far? School's a nightmare, agitated families, kids thinking they're rejects, hiding, fighting. This isn't healthy. But we get help. It has to do with the brain processing letters and sounds, instruction to help this process. Once we realize that letters have sounds, darn it, I lost my place, I'm sorry. Once we realize okay, you want me to just keep going? Words have letters, and letters have sounds. Our brains put it all together. We break the code of language and reading. We read, our outlook changes. We're happy, or we used to be mad.
You know, it's kind of interesting, sometimes these kids like Daquan are kind of put off and considered that they have this mysterious learning disability when in actuality they just need to be tutored consistently and in a program.
Down and try.
You would sit down and try,
With my
and you would try to read with her?
yeah.
And could you do that, or was it really too difficult for you? Difficult? Yeah.
No, it's not difficult.
Now
It's
it's
fun.
fun. Did you enjoy tutoring?
It was the best.
Right? Go.
Okay.
Here's your first word. You decide which vowel.
Claw.
Same, hear all the sounds and
Teach. See Sunday.
How would you say that? I consonants. That's right.
These opposite.
what kind of soul
Push.
how do you break out?
Climb. Sleep.
Change. You dear.
Oh.
Excellent, no way.
Sheep. And ears do.
What kind of soul is that?
Sheep. Salt. And ears tail.
Okay, so what's the difference between closed and open soul?
There's not a consonant at the end, and there's a consonant at the end.
Very good.
Oh, 19. I got it.
What's the situation today?
He reads a lot better now. I see a big difference. He's more acceptable. He's more just open-minded about everything. So we get along better. And now he gets along better with everybody else because he's not as angry or not as frustrated.
In a grocery store, she'll say, we gotta buy one because we can get one free. When she's playing piano, she's singing because she can read the words. When she's in the car, she tells us where we are, and she's much more social.
It's got an adjustable shoulder strap, dual nozzle settings, and constant pressure system.
Did he read that? He was capable of learning how to read.
How do you feel now, Spot? Just like everybody else. Can you?
She's got a confidence and self-esteem level that she didn't have before.
And to see her now with a smile on her face and a smile on her heart.
You know, I can read much better now, and my life is so much better because of it. And I'm really happy that I can.
This is the true story about a very brave dog.
You got it. They make me show the credits so you can see their name.
Also lived in Alaska. Known as a frontier town most of the year, it was buried under ice and snow. There was no way to travel through.
The guy that was narrating that, Andrew, has been with us since he was 5. He's in the Yale, Connecticut study. He's now 22. And he's doing a little bit better. The other kids are now 9, and they've been with us since 5. Now, they were all at below the 10th percentile at 6 and 6.5 years of age. And they're now all at the 50th and 60th percentile. So if we can get to the youngsters, as I have tried to point out, with some powerful stuff, and we get to them early, they'll help us out a little bit. They come right around. And but what's important to note is what they're telling us. If they don't learn to read, they really do shut down. And you can only see that if you walk along with them and watch how they remove themselves from the system fairly quickly. I used to think it was about 9 or 10 years of age where kids would get tired. We can watch the kids begin to avoid reading and classroom stuff at the end of 1st grade. They just pull off the task. And then we identify them as ADHD because one way they get out of the academic task is to look distracted and to be impulsive. And in fact, we call it iatrogenic ADHD, means system-induced rather than internally induced. And there's clearly internally induced attentional differences, but not at the levels that are being identified these days. So kids obviously are just like the rest of us. If they're put in a situation where they're supposed to know something and everybody's checking them out, and at that age they're very tender and they look stupid, well, then they're going to try to get out of it as quickly as they can. So when you see, I don't want to overstate this, but when you study about 34,000 kids and you see the same things over and over and over again, time and energy into actually studying why it is that it occurs and what you can do about it. And then you start to see the convergence of the evidence. In education, everybody always used to say, well, everybody's research says what they want it to say. You ever heard that? It's always been difficult to rely on research in education because people throw about research-based very, very loosely. And that's one of the reasons why Congress said, enough. Go look at all of the supposed research in education, particularly on reading, and come back to us with a definitive report that, number one, evaluates the quality of the research. So the panel report that'll come out a week from today first talks about the fact that 100,000 pieces of literature were examined. And they were examined to determine whether or not the studies were carried out in a way that you could trust it. That is, the studies had to define what they were doing and teaching. The studies had to define what the teaching procedures were. The studies had to define the kids. So if you're reading the study, you know who it pertains to. The studies, if they're testing the effects of instruction, had to have a control group. Well, less than 10% of educational studies met those simple criteria. Of those studies that met the criteria, there's no doubt that the things we're talking about today have to be in place. Kids have to have sound structure. They've got to know what that is. Most kids won't get it on their own, or when it's embedded in other things, they have to be taught. Just like you saw them moving all of that stuff around, the kids, with the tiles and all of that, that's so that they can get an idea that these sounds attach up to letters. They're actually working with it. That's what they're doing there. And they got to have phonics, and they got to read some good stuff, though, so they practice reading, so they get quick at it, and they don't have to spend a lot of time being glued to the print. And then we have to teach them a lot about what they're supposed to understand.
Could you talk a little bit about the screening process and what seems to be working?
Yeah, there are three things that give us a very good handle on who's at risk. One is the ability to understand that the language is made up of these sounds. Now that's a mouthful, but watch how you assess it. If I ask a 5.5-year-old to give me some words that rhyme with cat, a would-be good reader will say sat or mat. A would-be lousy reader, a predicted lousy reader, will say kitty or dog or something like that, even if they're very smart. Because why? Because in order to rhyme something with cat, you have to slice off the k sound, right? And replace it with, let's say, a s for sat. But how can you slice off the k sound if you don't know that cat has 3 sounds? That's why rhyming is such a cheap window on this stuff. Or we can say to kids that we're looking at, say big, and they say big. And we say big without the b sound. And the answer is ig, right? But to slice off the b, they have to know that big has 3 sounds. Remember, as we talk to one another, any syllable, any word that we use, your ear never hears the sounds. Never. And the only way little ones begin to understand, and like us at our age, we understand that big has b, I, g in it, is because somebody pointed that out to us somewhere along the line. You know? There's a bunch of languages that don't require you to chop up the sound structure and lay it on top of the letters. A lot of Asian languages just look at a big blurb of something and then map the concept to it, like in Chinese. But to read like that, you got to memorize 180,000 characters. That takes a long time, and that's why in China, anybody who reads is rich, because they have time. We have 22 letters and 44 sounds in our language, and once you can map all of that together, then you can basically read anything. It's a very democratic and dynamic language. So that sound stuff is critical. And sometimes I have a hard time, it's so jargony, but it's because people don't understand that what comes by your ear doesn't piece itself out. Big doesn't come by the ear as big. It comes by the ear as woof. And the brain has to pull out these small sounds. And why is that important? Because the small sounds then link to the letters. And that's the decoding part of our reading system. The ability to name letters and numbers quickly at 5.5 and 6 couples up with that and makes the prediction stronger. So if we, put the alphabet or plastic letters down there in random, and just show them to the kid and they have to name the letter. And then as they get older, name the sound. The speed at which they do that is very telling. And what that says is you can learn that words have the sounds, But equally important is how quickly you can link the letters with the sounds. So it's not only accuracy in knowing the sounds, but it's fluency and speed. So a lot of kids will teach with this phonemic stuff in phonics, but they'll still be very slow and labored when they read. If you've ever taught before, you know what I'm talking about, or if you've taught little ones, they kind of bark at the print and stuff. And then after a while, if we can arrange the reading material for them, they practice and start to get very fluent. And fluency is so critical because like when we read here, we're not paying any attention to the sounds or words. I mean, it's all unconscious. We have all of our energy to devote to what's being said in the print. And the harder it is for kids to bring the print off the page, the more labor they put in it, the less energy they have in a sense to understand what they read. In fact, when these kids start, or with any of our poor readers, when they're starting to get it and crack the code, they're still very slow. And they'll read and you ask them what they just read and they'll look at you like, I don't know, because all of their energy is going into the print stuff. Once they pick up speed, then that's they start to move along. So that ability to name letters and numbers quickly when they're randomly set out in front of you is couples up with the sound stuff to strengthen the prediction. A third thing that's important that gives a little oomph to the equation is something called print awareness. Those kids that at 5.5 know how to hold the book and know that it goes left to right and have some understanding of books and reading and stuff that we can ask them about has a little bit to do with it. Those three things actually couple together in a predictive equation that gives us about 90% accuracy, 85 to 90% accuracy.
Over-identify?
Sure, you over-identify. You have a lot of false positives. But the fact is, once you do these things don't tell you, to put kids through a meat grinder. This stuff tells you that you might want to start early playing with these things, doing this kind of instruction in a vibrant and entertaining way. And, if kids already have it, if they're false positives, they'll have fun with it, and then you can see they have it, and you don't have to beat them over the head with it. See, when I talk about all of these things that work, where the educational community freaks out is they think that you got to go through this lockstep and everybody has to have the same thing. And that's not the case. I mean, kids who have these skills don't need to have them in spades if they already have them. That's just common sense to me. But I don't.
What percentage would
I'm not sure in Vermont. I'd say you'd be hitting up around 35%. 35% at risk. It's hard to tell, but I would say about 35%. What have you got at older ages? Anybody know?
And for not reading?
Yeah.
By the end of second grade, 25% of the students aren't meeting the standard for reading comprehension and word recognition.
Okay, so it'd be 25%. I mean, the best predictor of reading at the end of second grade is these things I'm talking about, followed by reading at the end of the first grade. The best predictor of reading at the end of the 9th grade is reading at the end of the second grade. That's where it starts to get depressing. The best predictor of reading at 26 is the ability to understand that the language is made up of sounds. It's that robust. Yeah.
Speaking of standards, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Vermont standards. But Ryan probably are. Do we have the right standards? As far as reading is concerned, do we have the right standards?
Well, I'm not sure what they are, actually. I've been away for going on 10 years. But the standards, let's talk about that for a minute. We don't get into that level of policy, but I sure see states trying to do it. But standards have to permeate everything. There has to be accountability in standards, not only at the classroom level, but there has to be accountability in standards at the teacher preparation level. I keep coming back to this, but in a sense, as Texas has seen, they impose, and I think well thought out standards about where kids should be at certain age and grade points. They're not overbearing. You want kids to be able to access the information. So the standards are built to do that. And the standards say that what percentage of kids should be doing these things. But as I pointed out earlier, they don't have the horses yet to, in a sense, teach the kids in the way to move them to standards. And it becomes a very almost self-defeating situation, whatever the standards are, if you don't have things in place to cover every aspect of the delivery system. So it's an extraordinarily complex kind of thing. I do know that you can do all of these things all day long, but if you don't have standards and systems of accountability, then it'll never go anywhere. That's clearly the case.
Is the proper statement 25% of kids don't meet the standard, or is the proper statement 25% of the kids haven't been taught to meet the standard?
Yes, the second statement is clearly the case. There's just no doubt about that. There are a certain number of kids, no matter how strongly we come to them, that continue to struggle and really need way beyond what you would expect any kid. This is about 5 to 7%. 5% of the kids, it hovers more to me around 5% of kids really can have every advantage and every type of wherewithal, and they still struggle, and they need extraordinary consistency and extraordinary intensity to be able to come along. And even then, I mean, like Andrew's, been in this stuff now for, over 12 years, and he's finally kicking in, and he was sent to a school called Landmark that seemed to do a pretty good job for him. But the majority of kids aren't taught well. It's as simple as that. And the majority of teachers want to teach. That's the sad part. And the teachers get lambasted for it.
And how do we?
In terms of the way they use evidence.
We just gave them another year's reprieve. We told them we were going to hold them accountable this year for giving report cards on teacher training programs. They went down and whined and whined and whined. And the U.S. Congress said, okay, we'll let you off the hook for another year or two.
That's the power of those heavy units.
Power of the whine.
Yeah. But Congress didn't have what's going to be coming out Thursday. They didn't have that. They knew it was there. And so Mr. Goodling, is on his way out, but he's committed to trying to make the change at that level. Senator Jeffords appears committed to make the change at that level. Senator Dodd appears ready to do that on Jeffords committee, and Senator Kennedy. And so I think there's a possibility coming up that when this report hits, it's pretty clear. And it's going to scare people, I think, hopefully not too much, but the amount of research that is crappy is amazing. So that's the first thing Congress is going to go, holy mackerel, But the other beneficial things are that there are a series of things that are clearly beneficial for children. I mean, one of the big findings was that kids respond very well to this sound stuff, teaching sounds in preschool at 4 years of age. They like it, they get it. And those kids that get it do better as they get older. Kids in kindergarten, the biggest effects of phonics instruction are in kindergarten and the first grade. That means that if you get it to them then, they can start reading good stuff much earlier. But for good readers, kids who go through school, learn to read, the biggest effects of phonics is kindergarten and first grade, not third grade. And for kids who have difficulties learning to read, phonics has to come in at whatever age, like these kids, if they're going to get it. A negative finding was that the practice in our schools of having kids go sit down for 20 to 30 minutes a day and read on their own, sustained, silent, didn't have an effect. Now, why didn't it have an effect? It's intuitive that the more you read, the better you get. But what we think is happening is that teachers do that instead of teaching the skills, and they expect the kids to get it through their own practice. And a lot of kids may be sitting down with a book looking at it, and they don't know how to figure the words out, and that really doesn't do a heck of a lot of good to look at text that you don't understand. By the way, the readers, if they would have stayed below the 10th percentile, would read in 8 years what good readers read in a week. That's the difference. If they'd have stayed below the 10th percentile, they would have read in 8 years' time what good readers read in a week. And kids below the 10th percentile, if you want to concretize it a little bit more, read about a minute a day. I'm talking about processing text. They'll be sitting down looking at it, but they only read a minute a day, actually putting things together. So, one thing we have to realize is reading is a skill. It's not this natural, nature-given kind of device. It's a skill. It's made up of many componential skills that have to be integrated. It's like golf or music or whatever. For most children, it has to be instructed in a very informed way. Teachers have to know what does it take to learn to read, and they have to know how to present stuff so it comes alive for the kids. I mean, all that moving about of these letters and these letter cards, all that has a purpose. All that comes out of clinical trials. So, some kids don't understand that there's 3 sounds in big until they watch you move something around, and then they go, oh, I get it.
You mentioned before, and I'm just wondering if you've done in following your kids along, that you see some reading difficulties that may turn into some attentional difficulties, and then maybe later on some emotional and behavior difficulties. Because when I look at our child count data, some of which I've shared with the committees, is we see this huge jump, of course, in kids with identified as learning disabilities around 4th grade. We see another jump of kids with identified as attention deficit of some sort, 5th, 6th grade, and then a big jump of kids with emotional behavior problems like in 8th and 9th grade. And it just seems to kind of step up. And I'm wondering if your research has connected that to some basic reading difficulties, or if it's just not connected.
No, it is connected. There's many levels of what you're asking. Let's just take the example you're talking about. All you have to do is listen to the kids. Children who don't learn to read really aren't invested much in school. When you're talking about the 4th grade, everything after the 3rd grade is based on reading. All your content comes in through print. All your vocabulary, 90% of people's vocabulary after the 4th grade doesn't come from quack with each other. Our vocabularies that we took tests on to get into college come from print. I mean, you don't go around saying words like onomatopoeia. You know what I mean? That comes in print. And if you don't get it from print, you don't get it. So you're just disenfranchised extremely from the curriculum at every level if you can't learn to read. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if you're sitting there not in any way connected with the task at hand and with the peers and everything else, you're going to want to get out of it. And that's what Andrew was saying. He beat the hell out of people. He was a juvenile delinquent, very bright kid, very good artist, as you can see. But despite all of that strength and all of his good intelligence and everything else, he still was frustrated enough to do that. The attentional issue is more complex. Clearly at young ages, the differentials for ADD used to be that it had to be observable by 4 years of age. And typically severe ADHD can. We call it the parental zenith. That's when you peel the parents off the ceiling kind of thing. And it probably is the case that your increase in frequency of identification of ADHD among academically disadvantaged kids, I don't mean disadvantaged, but academically low kids, is due to instructional factors, not intrinsic biological factors. That's probably the case. But there is something that comes with a certain percentage of kids, more boys than girls, that make them a bit tough to deal with. You should be seeing that fairly early on. When you're seeing it fairly later on, it may be more a consequence than it would be a presaging factor.
Could you talk a little bit about the gender issues? I've heard you talk about that before.
With reading, the gender issues don't seem to obtain. We used to think more boys than girls had reading difficulties, and they do if you look at special ed. If you look at the number of boys that are identified for reading problems with special ed, it's about 4 to 6 to 1 across the country. I'm not sure exactly state by state. But if you do what are called epidemiological studies, where we're looking at everybody, as we do in this stuff, the ratio is 1.2 to 1. So just as many little girls show us the same reading difficulties, their behavior is much more adaptive, though. They don't get as frisky or rowdy and stuff like that. When you're getting referrals for special ed, Dennis, as you know, the prime mover for that is generally behavior. It's the behavior of the kid, not the academics. And for little girls who are socially adept, they aren't picked up ever sometime. Whereas the boys will begin to accompany the reading problem with this behavioral stuff and they'll get picked up. With ADD, when we see it in more severe cases, that's 4 to 6 to 1 boys. And that is a fairly stable prevalence differential.
Reid, in terms of that 25 to 30% population that you spoke about, is there a cutoff for sequential cumulative instruction at the 4th grade, or should that be going through middle school and possibly high school?
Well, what the report on Thursday will say is that instruction which is most effective for kids having difficulty is systematic, is direct. No, it shouldn't cut off. I mean, your question is, though, one of resources, it seems, because after 4th grade, your teachers aren't trained to teach reading. They'll tell you that right out. They're not going to learn to read by any other way other than systematic and direct instruction. They won't. But the question is, do you want them to read, or do you get the content to them in different ways? Now, in the best of all worlds, and what I would suggest is they've got to learn to read. And that's where the emphasis should be. But these are kids that have to, in order to graduate, in order to move on, have to learn history and science and social studies and so on. And the reality, this is again why early intervention and prevention is so critical. Now you're working at policy levels where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. That's why I think it's just ridiculous to wait for all of this. Yes, sir.
You said they have to learn history and so on and so forth. What they really have to do is learn how to read.
Well,
maybe what we ought to be doing in school is making sure they know how to read first. Then we worry about whatever else they're going to learn. But that flies in the face of the kind of standards movement
that's right.
That's in place. So I think we need to rethink the standards movement.
Yeah.
And we need to set the standards, first of all, learn how to read. Then we can worry about what the other standards are.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. My point is that, again, these standards that are set really do position the educational system for certain trends. And that's what I was trying to suggest here, that you can penalize a little one or a young human being by focusing on reading and not being flexible enough to do what you're saying.
Sesame Street and reading recovery. Okay. When you were talking earlier about making it fun and this and that and the other, is there anything in this report coming out, or your own personal opinion, that Sesame Street's been good?
Well, actually, Sesame Street didn't do the kinds of studies that we would have to say it, but I think Sesame Street had a lot of neat components in it. There's a new program out called Between the Lions. It's a PBS production. Bennett Cerf's son actually produced that, a very bright guy. He spent a lot of time at our different sites looking at all of this. And that's under trial now. We're studying Between the Lions, but it certainly has some good components in it. You'll notice how they do the sounds and all of that kind of stuff. So we'll have to wait and see, but it would be, as Sesame Street is, do no harm. Reading recovery is a tough one because you got two origins of research. You've got research coming out of the reading recovery groups, and then you've got the independent research, and the two don't match, unfortunately. Now, I think that reading recovery is effective, just like anything else is, for certain children at certain stages of development. There is never going to be a one-size-fits-all, and this goes back to teacher preparation. In the report that will be coming out on Thursday, the independent evaluations show that reading recovery can work for those kids who aren't reading well, but the more milder kids in 1st grade. The kids that aren't discontinued in the parlance of reading recovery are kids typically seen in special ed. Unfortunately, when they're not discontinued, and if they don't have the discrepancy, where do they go? And so they churn around in the system and get further behind. Now, the actual experimental manipulations of reading recovery have been done in about 3 labs, and it converges on the following. That reading recovery works best for kids having more difficulties when the sound structure stuff is really boosted very directly and systematically. Reading recovery was developed from a holistic paradigm where, again, the idea is if you put children into environments and you expose them to certain kinds of things, they will construct, if you will, their own knowledge. They'll access all of these bits and pieces without having to be taught the bits and pieces. Some kids can do it, some kids can't. I think we know which ones can and can't. But what you do is you force a system, not you, but systems are forced into buying certain things, which are touted as this or that, where in fact their efficacy is only for a selected segment of the population. So the question isn't really, does reading recovery work? The question should be, who does it work for? And is there something else that's less expensive and more applicable for everyone else? That should be the issue. But in education, you get roiled up into the reading wars things with this, and it really takes you off task. But if we had very good teachers, it goes back to teaching. You wouldn't need any program. A good teacher would be able to say, not, am I a reading recovery teacher or am I a direct instruction teacher? A good teacher would say, what does it take to learn how to read? Well, it takes some exposure and background. Well, most of my kids don't have it. I can't do anything about it. What else does it take? It takes understanding the sound structure, the phonemes. It takes linking those sounds or phonemes to letters. It takes practice to do that fluently. It takes being taught very directly some strategies about how to understand what you're reading, questions you ask yourself. So that teacher could be freed up to take some of this from reading recovery, some of this from direct instruction, some of this from Orton Gillingham, and put it together. I don't know of any other professional, from an architect to an attorney to a physician, that goes through a cookbook in a sense and doesn't borrow from different kinds of procedures. But that's all based upon what they know. We continue to come back to the content expertise of our teachers. And that brings us back to university and college preparation programs. And we're always behind the 8 ball. We're always trying to catch up. So Dennis will bring in people that, come in and do their guru thing. The make it and take it folks. And they come in and like myself, he's had me come in before, and, I violate every principle of human learning. I sit there and quack away, then leave. Nobody gets to practice. Nobody gets to, do it in front of you so that they can get some good feedback. We violate every principle.
I think up to about 15 or so, your references to teacher preparation in this short time. And I think it could be helpful to us if you could point us to any model teacher education program, or let's say teacher re-education program, since most of our teachers are now in the classroom. But can you help us by pointing us to anywhere in the country or the world that we could look at if we want to radically change these programs?
I sure can. Actually, a Vermonter, usually I don't like to give anecdotes because I'm an experimental guy, but we have a very large project in Washington, D.C. It's one of the 42 sites. And keep in mind that in the best schools in Washington, D.C., the average reading level is the 30th percentile. We are in 8 targeted assistant schools in Washington, D.C., the worst. Over 99% of the students in these schools are on free and reduced lunch. These kids come into our studies at 5 years of age from environments you wouldn't believe. The infrastructure educationally in DC is abysmal. It would blow you away. You would think you're in nirvana if you went there and came back to Vermont. What we took on in DC was to try to take the lowest hard-hit schools in the country, and we figured if we could do it there, we could do it anywhere. Those schools now in Washington, D.C. Are moving along quite well. It's a wonderful feeding ground for Congress. They love now to go to the DC schools and get their pictures taken. In those 8 schools, 6 of those are now at the 50th percentile. Some are above the 50th percentile of those 6. 2 are still having problems. The person who directs that particular arm of our treatment protocol is Louisa Moats. Now, to be able to invest Washington, D.C. in doing research at this level in that community, you just don't go in and say, we want to study your kids and we'll help you. You know, you have to bring them something. And so we went to Mr. Goodling, and Mr. Goodling said, well, let's bring them teacher preparation of the kind that the teachers in the treatment schools are getting. Now, let me talk about what they're getting. They come to NIH for a 40-hour stretch and that's quite a bit of time when it's concentrated and you've got pretty good materials and so forth in front of them. They come to NIH in the summers for 40 hours. They learn what it takes to learn to read, what goes wrong, and what you do about it. Of course, they don't learn much. It's all still abstract, even if it's 40 good hours. They go back into their classrooms, and we have people in those classrooms that make sure that they are carrying out what's called the protocol. You know, if we're testing one set of approaches against other sets of approaches, you got to make sure that people are doing the approaches, and that's called fidelity. And so we have to check the fidelity of the treatment. And we have other people in there that work right along with them and model and demonstrate the kinds of things and show them and so forth. And then we have Louisa and her group not only doing that, but giving university credit for full coursework and exactly what these people are getting for semesters and so forth. And that coursework has the following. It has the content. The people then watch as the teachers move through some of these more complex interactions. Then they carry those out in their classroom with guidance and feedback and so forth. It's the same as learning any complex kind of thing. So Louisa is a master at it. And she's done that in Washington, and I think that's amazing. And if you talk about accountability, when you see schools below the 2nd percentile, now at the 50th and 60th percentile, you got to say something about the teaching, and I'm not overstating that. That's the case. But that's $500,000 a year Congressman Goodling appropriates for that teacher preparation program, so it gets very expensive. So you have somebody that's very dear to this state and very loyal to Vermont, I would think, and knows she can teach a stone to read. But she's very good at it, and she's very good at teachers to read, but she doesn't have a lot of patience, and she doesn't have a lot of patience with academics who want to continue down the same path and so forth. And so that probably gets her in trouble a little bit. But in terms of the gains we've seen in children and their lives, she's changed tremendous lives. And she's doing it in an experimental setting, by the way. We have other approaches that are same as usual, and those aren't doing well at all. So yes?
I just want to make sure folks know that the Stern Center for Language and Learning in Williston, in consultation with Louisa, set up a program called Project Time in Vermont, which does do that model. So we are doing some of these things.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't mention that. And that is true. Blanche has been working on these same issues for years. And thanks for...
I had a question.
Yeah.
A question on how some of what you've learned might translate into policy. But I know that the fairly recent federal special education regulations allow states to change the way that they identify young children for special education, that you don't have to hang a label on them until they get to be 9 years old. What do you see as the merits or lack of merits?
Well, that was actually the crumb thrown basically to us at NIH when we testified that they should bag the whole discrepancy thing. But to do that brings lobbyists from a variety of corners to the fore who want to maintain that particular set of procedures for whatever reason. So what they were trying to do was to provide states with an opportunity to not have to obviously wait until 9 years of age or until a discrepancy occurred to put into motion, but it's still not strong enough. But that's the crumb they threw.
You're talking about poverty. I presume you're talking about it as being highly correlated with an inability to read and not causative.
Yes, it's only correlated. Absolutely. Because again, I'm talking about kids in DC that when they're taught, they clearly read. The only reason poverty, and it's more, it's not ethnicity. It's certainly not race. It's SES that really drives this stuff down. And when you get into the guts of it, you see that, what's correlated with poverty is little to no books in the home, parental reading levels that are limited, no practice, no lap time reading. I mean, these are actually things we'll study. Amount of lap time reading, amount of bedtime reading, number of books in the home, parents' reading level or caretaker reading level, and so on. Trips to the library. I mean, you're talking about minuscule interactions. And so why it impacts on reading is when they come into preschool, kindergarten, and first grade, they really don't have an idea what the job is. They really
That's pretty direct.
Well, there are some kids that we find that come out of substantial advantage. I mean, just to put an extreme to it, where you got two parents that are professionals. They've been reading to the kid since the kid was in utero through a stethoscope, every advantage you could imagine. And boy, still, these are dyslexic children and still do not get it very well at all. And they show us something genetically and neurobiologically. And some kids from poverty also show us that, but not because of the poverty. So I just want to be clear about that.
In any of the classroom research, can you make any generalizations about the use of classroom aids and the impact upon achievement of the students?
In every study that we're doing that has classroom aids involved, they always, and I'll say always because we hadn't seen any contradictory evidence, they bring about, if aids are providing the program, the achievement levels are lower. Class size is a big issue. I wish somebody had studied class size before they went down, all kinds of roads with that. It's intuitive that class size would be positive for achievement, but if you got a lousy trained teacher in there, you can have 3 and still not do any good. So
You correlated proper reading instruction with ultimate cost of special ed and other special services programs?
We haven't, but we certainly have looked at it because we get this question a lot. In fact, I just worked this up for Mr. Goodling. Let me remember how we did this. All right, nationally, we're running 5.2% of the special ed population, of the general population ages 6 to 21 is learning disabled, 5.2%. I believe that translates to 250 million kids. Now, what would that be? Yeah, that's all of us. That's right. That's on the IQ test. Yeah. 2.5 million. Yep. And of those LD kids, and I'm not sure, again, state by state, but nationally, of the learning disabled population, remember you can be LD federally according to 7 designations. You can be LD in listening, speaking, basic reading, reading comprehension, arithmetic calculation, mathematics reasoning, and written expression. So you can come onto the LD roles as having a discrepancy between IQ and achievement in any one of those 7 areas. But 80% of our kids identified as LD have their primary difficulty in reading, okay? So 2.5%, or whatever 2.5, whatever the number is. If you look at, 5.2% of the general population, LD is what percent of the special ed population? 60%. And then if you take 80% of your LD kids who have problems in reading, and you get to them early and intervene such that of those LD kids in reading, all but 5% are okay, that should move you down those roads. I don't know the dollar figures, but clearly you're going to reduce.
It's not just those that you're going to say, it's probably a percentage of the kids that end up being EBD, a percentage of the kids that end up being attentional deficit disorder.
Yeah. But we,
It's a bigger number than that.
well, there is, but we only have data on the number of kids responding to certain instructional trials. I can't talk about, I mean, we're following them, so we'll know that, but not now. But yeah, my hunch would be you clearly are going to wipe away, a lot of this stuff.
Building on Michael's points before, some of the questions he said, you started off by talking about Texas, and it sounds like in Texas is screening every kid.
Yes, they are.
And they're immediately going from the screening to the identification of that risk and service, and they're not going through the special ed.
Right. That's right. We can't do studies anymore in Texas to contrast different reading approaches. I mean, this may be the best thing about the research we're doing. You can't find in Texas classrooms that allow us to contrast anymore this instructional approach and this instructional approach because they've now integrated all of that. Now, whether they do it well or not is the problem. We're still back to, teachers being asked to do things and trying to do things, but still making some mistakes. So we're not as powerful as we want. But yes, they go directly to, teacher assistance teams and stuff like that. Vicki?
I think on the same wavelength as Richard. It sounded as though you were talking about strategies that would be part of general ed, so to speak.
Yes.
But then when we got into the change or the potential change in eligibility for special ed to pick kids up earlier, it begins to sound like maybe special ed would own that, which I think is a mistake.
Yeah.
So could you describe to us, you just said a little bit about Texas. I mean, if you were a school superintendent in Vermont, what would you do right now to change to reflect the research that you know?
Well, I don't know if a school superintendent can do it. Why don't you make me something else that could do it?
What do you recommend for education? What would you do?
It is not a special ed problem, Vicki. It is, the first thing that has to be done is that every teacher, particularly those specializing in elementary education or early childhood education, are all on the same page with respect to the three questions that are being addressed. In Texas, again, they're asking the regular education system to do the screening, which they can do, to bring to bear the best strategies for intervention early on, which is still extremely variable, and so on. And that's the weak link. If I were the commissioner, I'd have to go directly to the university president and say that your calling is higher than you've ever seen before, that for you to get state funding, your medical school has to produce competent physicians, your departments of education have to produce competent teachers, and if that doesn't happen, then you will not receive the support that we as a state give you. And that's what, I tend to be on the other side of the political fence than GW or George W., but that's what he's done. He's been fairly harsh with his colleges of ed in a sense. And I have to say that 5 years ago, he was the one that called us down to Texas and said, what do you guys know and stuff. He's been on that for quite a while. And he had a very strong commissioner of education by the name of Mike Moses. And Mike was very strong. He has changes in the mill now, which seem to be working pretty well, but you just don't change things overnight. And we're still wrestling with how you change the academic freedom tenure stuff, because that really gets in the way. But money always drives everything, seems to me. But that's where you have to start, because, it's not a regular or special education issue. Frankly, when we talk about regular and special education, it shouldn't divide on the basis of who knows what content. It should divide on the basis of intensity and duration of instruction.
And I'm sort of back to where you started out today, I think, saying we don't usually give things time to find out that we're going to jump into them. Well, I guess that's what I'm wanting to know. Is there something that you could jump into? I'm imagining doing this screening and identifying children who need this kind of intensity. Does it make any sense then to have those children be in a special kind of kindergarten with a teacher who really knows what you're talking about?
Yes. Are there advantages to that? Absolutely. Yes. I mean, if you're asking, I can answer these questions very directly. Children at risk for reading failure who would have gone through their tenure without probably picking up the slack come around when they are provided instruction that builds on the research we're talking about. That's what you saw in this film. Those Syracuse kids are nicely up to good fundamental levels. The kids in DC are nicely up to good fundamental levels. That didn't happen because they were screened. That happened because they were screened and provided with instruction that built upon the converging evidence.
What was your question? Having to do with homogeneous grouping of those students together, you said, are you saying that homogeneous grouping of those students is a good idea?
If you're going to give me a choice between homogeneous or heterogeneous grouping, of course. Let's look at it. You've got one person dealing with 15 individuals. Heterogeneous grouping would be nice if among those kids who were having difficulties, they could seek information from those that weren't and model from them. That is a nice model for things like social and behavioral problems. And to some degree, more low incidence handicaps. Autistic kids seem to benefit from heterogeneous grouping, as do more severe mentally retarded kids, because they're watching and modeling interactions that are concrete and in front of them. There is no way a youngster is going to learn how to read by watching other kids read. There ain't no way. There's no way you're going to learn how to play the piano by watching somebody play the piano. Unless you got...
Have you in your group seen models of where that instruction has taken place, say small group instruction, within a more heterogeneous grouping, so that you're not putting all the at-risk kids together?
Definitely. And we have film of yes, that clearly is the case, but that all rides on the teacher's capability. But yes, but in our California work, who's seen the Chuck film? I don't know if, but yes, there's a classroom of 25 kids varying from the 99th percentile to the first, and there are smaller groups of kids that come in and out with this teacher to work on varying skills. But again, this is a teacher who has great classroom management. She's been doing it for 20 years. She was trained as a reading recovery teacher, a whole language teacher, and she's not into religious beliefs, so she can meld it all together and stuff like that. So yeah, but that is definitely doable. You know, we've got to separate the issues. We've got to talk about the conditions under which instruction has an effect, and then we've got to talk about the surrounding environment, policy, and otherwise that may mitigate or influence that positively. The conditions that need to be in place for kids who are not understanding what you're teaching them falls on, number one, the teacher's understanding of what they have to know. What are the most critical things they have to know to be able to do it? Secondly, and as importantly, how does she represent it? How does she show it to them so that it clicks? And how much practice time is necessary, and so on. Within that series of decisions, she has to determine how intense the instruction is and how long it lasts. And she has to determine if there are other children who do not have those same difficulties that she has to attend to. At the same time, that reduces intensity and reduces duration, and that mitigates against optimal stuff. So I know homogeneous grouping has been looked at with somewhat askance over the years because of its tendency to segregate and to produce inappropriate behaviors in kids. Clearly, that's not the issue here. We're talking about the conditions or the environment that fosters intensity and duration and the translation of information from one person to another. Always remember, if you can, to put your shoes in put yourself in the shoes of these kids. I don't know how you did in algebra, but I didn't do too well in algebra. And I remembered being in a class of 20 or 25, and when I asked for help, it came in little snippets because other people knew it, and they wouldn't give me the time for that kind of thing. When I got a tutor in algebra, and the intensity and the time and the expertise in terms of showing me what it really meant kicked up, then I got it. And algebra may not be where you might have seen a challenge, but there's something in every one of our lives where someone had to show us, tell us, or do something with us differently to get us to understand it. And that couldn't have been done in an environment where the person showing it was too spread out.
Over the issue of training and retraining a new workforce, because I think, are all in agreement that there's a lot of work to do there. As we went into this, ballooning of special ed, we stopped training those people that, in my days in schools, we used to call reading specialists. Now, is that an efficient way to get the university, to get the state colleges, to back off on some of the stuff they're doing and say, we have a critical shortage, we want reading specialists in Vermont schools in the next 5 years? Are there still viable programs of training reading specialists?
Well, I think there are some states that are actually now legislating just that. I think Georgia is. But they have us talk with them as well, and the answer will be the same, and that is you can have any specialist you want, but whether or not the university can train those individuals in a different way.
The issue of higher education's capacity is always assumed, but never analyzed.
And if you look at the current state of affairs in Georgia or Vermont or Texas, in front of us sit some very clean data that says that a lot of children aren't getting it. Now, if one asks the universities to then train reading specialists to help them get it, but it's the same faculty and same, where I'm going with this. What would happen in Vermont is
We're
there.
small enough, we ought to be able to build the capacity.
Yes.
But we did it with the consulting teacher program.
Yeah.
Not that I like that program, but we did it.
Well, but that program actually did have a strong efficacy with certain kinds of learners. Not all, and as anything, I think probably we do one size fits all. The minute something starts to crank up, there's nothing more that we've got to understand than this. It is not what works best. It is what works best for which kids at which ages and stages of development and in which environments and stuff. It really is that complex, but it's not that complex. I mean, we saw problems like that all the time. For which children are which instructional approaches most beneficial at which stages of development? Because whole language, which gets a bad lick in some quarters, actually has some neat things that can be intertwined if it's done sensibly. But, whole language, remember, didn't start as a teaching approach. It is a philosophy of instruction. It's a philosophy. It never was an instructional approach. It was a philosophy that children should construct their own knowledge and that teachers would not be, purveyors of knowledge, but guides and so forth and so on. Now that it is not effective whatsoever until children have acquired the means by which they can take advantage of that constructive process, at which stage of development.
Just following on this last sort of these reading specialists, the flavor that I got from